living La Vida low carb. This show is changing lives. We talking about your diet, trying to get you feeling right. Cut up them avocados, fry some eggs, time to explore the longest running health podcast, hosted by Jimmy Moore. Time to give up the crappy garbage. We're getting into ketosis. Every day is a new step to your goal. Yeah, you're getting closer, motivated and focused. Don't stop, just go. Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Living La Vida Low Carb Show with Jimmy Moore. And today we have a really fascinating study to share with you here on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. I do this show on Instagram called Jimmy Makes Science Simple. So go follow me over there on Instagram. It's Jimmy Makes Science Simple as a username. So go just type that in and you can follow all these videos that I do. I occasionally will share these on my podcast because it's really interesting information. And today's study is no less than interesting. It is a study that was just published in the June 2021 issue of the journal Frontiers in Neuroscience. It's from some Italian researchers, and the title of the study, Long-Term Overconsumption of Sugar Starting at Adolescence Produces Persistent Hyperactivity and Neurocognitive Deficits in Adulthood. And so this just came out. Looks like there was some researchers as well out of Brisbane, Australia, and in various places. So yeah, it looks like most of the researchers are in Australia. It was edited. The Frontiers in Neuroscience is out of Italy. So, and it's got review board from people in China, and the senior author Selena Bartlett and Amald Belmer, both out of, where's this? It's in Queensland University of Technology in Australia. As well as the School of Biosciences at the University of Queensland. Lots of nerdy people looking at neuroscience as it relates to your health and what impacts all those things. So really fascinating study, because we have long surmised that sugar consumption when you're a child will impact you neurologically, cognitively, mood, all of these things as you enter into adulthood. And it seems a little bit obvious to a lot of people, especially those of us that pay attention to the negative effects in the hormone levels when you have sugar and refined carbohydrates. But now we have a study that wants to look at what that impact is. So let me read from the first part here. Sugar has become embedded in modern food and beverages. That's putting it lightly. This has led to the overconsumption of sugar in children, adolescents, and adults, with more than 60 countries consuming more than 4 times 100 plus grams per person per day that the World Health Organization recommends. They recommend 25 grams per person per day. Recent evidence suggests that obesity and impulsivity from poor dietary habits leads to further overconsumption of processed food and beverages. And it's so true. When people deny the addictiveness of especially refined carbohydrates, I go, okay, have something sugary and then don't eat for the next 24 hours and tell me how you feel. And most people, when they have something sugary, it starts to stoke hunger, cravings for more of something sugary. And so that's the problem. So the long-term effects of cognitive processes and hyperactivity from sugar overconsumption beginning at adolescence is thus far unknown. Using a well-validated mouse model of sugar consumption, we found that long-term sugar consumption at a level that significantly augments weight gain, in other words, eating it actually leads to weight gain, which again seems obvious to a lot of us, and yet most people aren't putting that connection. They think weight gain is from fat overconsumption, calorie overconsumption, but sugar boosting insulin. And when I say sugar, I mean not just sweet stuff, but refined carbohydrates, things that would raise insulin, always lead to weight gain. It elicits an abnormal hyperlocomotor response to novelty and alters both episodic and spatial memory. So they're saying it has a direct impact on your noggin. Which is why when I often tell people, they're like, "You're still fat, Jimmy." I'm like, do you know anybody that is more sharp, works hard, has like good memory than me? Like a lot of people, they say, "Wow, you remember things and you seem very sharp on camera. Like, how do you do that?" And I'm like, nutrition. Like, that's where it comes from. And so let that guide you if you start getting those boo birds yourself in your life. Our results are similar to those reported in attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders. The deficits in hippocampal dependent learning and memory were accompanied by altered hippocampal neurogenesis with an overall decrease in the proliferation and differentiation of newborn neurons within the dentate gyrus. Okay, it's a little nerdy in this post. Just stick with some of that gobbledygook of the nerdiness of the words because it's making a greater overall point. And here's the overall point. This suggests that long-term overconsumption of sugar, like appears in the Western diet, might be a contributing factor to an increased risk of developing persistent hyperactivity and neurocognitive deficits in adulthood. So how you eat as a kid directly impacting how you eat or how you react mentally, mood-wise as an adult. Now, let me be the first to admit this is a mouse study. You guys know I'm a big fan of randomized control clinical trials being the gold standard. So everything that I'm sharing here today is a nice hypothesis for testing in humans in a randomized controlled, double-blind, placebo manner at some point down the road. But the implications of what they're sharing, we have had bits and pieces in other stories or studies that actually underscore these things as facts. So let's get to the introduction of the study. The concept of sugar addiction and the classification of sugar as a substance of abuse are still heavily debated. Why? Why are we still debating the addictiveness of sugar and refined carbohydrates? Why is that still even controversial? I remember I was invited on a national TV show appearance. I want to say it was The Doctors. This has been 3 or 4 years ago, and they said, "Hey, we're looking for an expert to come and argue against the addictiveness of food." And I'm like, you do realize I think people are addicted to food, right? Yeah, but you could take the other side. I'm like, no, I can't, because it's heavily addictive, especially refined carbohydrates and sugars. I thought that was funny. But it's not debated in my mind. I think most people that are thinking this through, they know, especially when they look at brain scans of animals and even humans, when you feed them sugar and refined carbohydrates, the part of the brain that lights up is the same one that lights up with illicit drugs like heroin, crack cocaine, ecstasy, those kinds of things. And so, no, it's highly addictive. There is, however, increasing evidence of overlap in the brain circuitry and molecular signaling pathways involved in sugar consumption and drug abuse, as I was just mentioning. Humans consume sugar and food to regulate homeostatic energy balance, basically the calories that you need to live, but also to eat for pleasure and comfort, which is true. And we often forget, okay, we sometimes eat not because we're hungry, but because we're bored, because we're seeking relief from some pain in our lives. We eat a lot of things that kind of make us feel good. Here in the South, we have a lot of comfort foods, and they're mostly crappy garbage. And so, yeah, people eat for a lot of reasons beyond just nutrition needs. So this is the hedonic pathway, which gives you a desire for palatable food. It's reward-driven. Overeating may result in maladaptive negative neuroplasticity that overrides homeostatic regulation. So in humans, sugar and sweetness can induce a dopamine release. And I love how they put that, sugar and sweetness. So sometimes we in the keto community, we're like, well, we have our stevia and our erythritol and our... It's sweetness, guys. And it can still turn on those pathways in your brain, which is why I tell people, don't rely so heavily on that taste of sweet in your diet. Make it an occasional thing, sure, but if you have it every day, are you really turning off that signaling to your brain of the sweetness, which makes it hard for you to break away from the addictiveness of the sugar. Reward and craving that are comparable in magnitude to those induced by addictive drugs, suggesting that sugar changes the brain reward signaling and circuitry similar to all these drugs of abuse. High sugar and or high fat diets have been shown to precipitate addiction-like psychiatric phenotypes in a number of rodent studies. Well, I'm going to push back on this part, because I think a high fat diet absent of high sugar and high refined carbohydrates is not addictive. Hyperpalatability comes in when you get the right amount of sugar and fat in combination. And so there is this kind of bliss point. You add in salt in there as well. There's this bliss point that a lot of the food manufacturers try to take advantage of mixing sugar, salt, and fat together in just the right amounts that you become addicted to them, that you really can't stop yourself once you're eating them. So they're quoting the rodent studies that said high sugar diets or high fat diets will have this addictive-like property. I think high sugar, it's obvious. High fat alone and or with protein, no, it's not going to happen. Those of you that eat carnivore, you can attest that all those addictiveness, patterns in your diet go away. And you spontaneously really don't feel like eating after you've had a nice big steak. You really don't want to have much else to eat. So you're not addicted. In rats, intermittent consumption of 10% sucrose or 25% glucose solution elicits hallmark signs of addictive behavior of binging, tolerance, and craving, cross-sensitization, and symptoms of withdrawal such as anxiety, depression, and those kinds of things. We've seen that, we've lived that. In addition, sugar consumption has been shown to increase reward seeking, an impulse to feed, and compulsivity in rats willing to endure noxious stimuli such as extreme cold, heat, and foot shock just to get the sugar and highly palatable foods. In other words, that's a telltale sign you're addicted. And I tell people, they say, well, I'm not addicted to sugar. I'm like, all right, give it up for 30 days. And call me in 2 days to tell me how you're feeling. And most of the time, if they actually take me up on it, most go, I would never do that. Okay, well, you're addicted. Because if you weren't addicted, you could easily walk away from it and you wouldn't have any withdrawals or anything. But if within a couple of days, 2-3 days, you're like pining for it and you would walk over glass to get to it, you're addicted. It's amazing to me, people, I'm not addicted. But then you kind of challenge them to give it up and you find out right away they're highly addicted. Interestingly, rats are also more resilient to foot shock punishments when seeking for palatable food compared to meth. So they would literally try to find highly palatable food over meth, even though they're getting shocks in their feet while they're trying to pursue that food. They'll just, it hurts, but that feels so good. And man, that is some strong pull in that brain making you do that. Increasing evidence shows that unrestricted consumption of high sugar food and beverages within the Western diet may be linked to an increase in obesity. I don't think there's any question about that at this point. A strong association between ADHD and overweight and obesity has also been further revealed. Taken together, this data suggests that sugar-induced obesity may participate to the developing pathogenesis of ADHD-like symptoms in Western society. In children, high sugar consumption correlates directly with hyperactivity. Oh, mama used to say that. Oh, I can't feed you too much sugar, you'll be bouncing off the walls, is what she always said. And what she meant was very hyperactive. And then in adults, how does that manifest? You're not necessarily bouncing off the walls or hyperactive like a child would be. It looks like inattention. It also looks like impulsivity. You know those adults that are like that. They're not really paying attention to much in life. They're kind of walking their own path. And an impulsivity, meaning you jumping from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And this is the impact of that sugar when they reach adulthood. However, some inconsistencies remain regarding the potential correlation or not with ADHD. In rodents, high sucrose consumption also impaired neurocognitive functions, things like spatial learning, object recognition, behavior inhibition, and fear memory. So these are all like deep embedded thoughts and things that manifest on the outside. And it's directly related. They say there's inconsistent, whether it's correlated or not, to the ADHD that was induced by the sugar consumption. Really fascinating stuff. Interestingly, high sucrose intake during pregnancy can also elicit ADHD-like behavioral phenotypes in mice with increased locomotor activity, reduced attention and learning, and again, that impulsivity comes into play. That manifests as anxiety, depression, cognitive deficits. All of these are strongly associated with an impaired hippocampal neurogenesis in all the animal models, although evidence for a causative relationship is often lacking. Indeed, anxiety and spatial memory deficits elicited by long-term consumption of sucrose are accompanied by alterations in hippocampal neurogenesis and physiology.
Having a hard time reaching my goal weight.
Just use Keto Chow, the magical meal replacement that makes keto easy. Prep takes seconds. Just add the fat you want, Keto Chow, water, and shake. And before you know it, you'll be getting rid of the fat you don't want.
I did it!
I can't believe you're finally here! I thought
Jimmy
you'd be taller.
loves KetoChow.com.
So while drugs of abuse such as ethanol are known to negatively affect neurogenesis, the effect of high levels of sugar consumption requires further characterization, since a link between neurogenesis to anxiety and depression has not actually been explored. So that's one of the things that they're doing, the Aussie researchers are doing in their paper. Sucrose became embedded in modern food and beverages, and the aforementioned studies suggest that sugar overconsumption satisfies all the criteria for the classification of sugar as a drug of abuse. Oh man, how amazing would that be if everything that had sugar on it, and when I say sugar, I mean anything that's a derivative of sugar, so high fructose corn syrup, we could go down the line of all the names they have for sugar now. How cool would it be if they put warning signs on anything that contains that just like they did the warning labels on cigarettes. Warning, this could cause obesity, metabolic health issues such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and have it right there. It would be required to be put on food packagings, because they're saying we have all the criteria met to call sugar a drug of abuse, with its chronic abuse proposed to produce people who are overweight, locomotor, emotional, and cognitive impairments. It's going to mess with your brain. It's going to mess with your emotions. It's going to make you a blubbering mess if you don't get off that shit. Literally. However, it remains unclear whether a lifetime of chronic overconsumption of sucrose, which starts in childhood and adolescence, affects locomotive behavior, emotions, and cognition through adulthood. Therefore, we used a mouse model of long-term intake of sucrose to determine the effects on locomotion, anxiety, memory, and the hippocampal neurogenesis. Our results show for the first time that long-term consumption of sucrose leads to significant weight gain, and it produces persistent hyperactivity and learning impairments correlated to reduced hippocampal neurogenesis in adult mice. These results suggest that long-term sugar intake in the Western diet might play a role in the pathogenesis of attention deficits and hyperactivity-related disorders. Good stuff, guys. So let's take a look at what they did. Here are the material and methods. So the animals and the housing, let's look at those first. So they had 5-week-old male, and I'm going to get a little bit technical because this is the kind of mice they use in these studies always matters. So this one is called a C57BL 6J mice. They were individually housed under reverse light cycle conditions. They turned the light off at 9 a.m. in a climate-controlled room with an ad libitum access to food, standard mouse chow, and water. Following 1 week of habituation to the housing conditions, The mice were then given sucrose or water during the drinking sessions. All of the procedures were approved by the University of Queensland, as well as the Queensland University of Technology Animal Ethics Committee, and they complied with all the policies, blah, 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 blah. All right, sucrose consumption. Let's look at what they fed them. All of the mice had food and acidified filtered water available at all times to them. The sucrose solution was prepared freshly weekly, and was presented in 50 milliliter plastic Falcon tubes fitted with rubber stoppers and a 6.35 centimeter stainless steel sipper tube with double ball bearings. In other words, they had access, plenty of access to get to this if they wanted it. Mouse weights were measured daily to calculate the adjusted gram per kilogram intake of sucrose. 2 groups of mice, 23 mice per group, had ad libitum access to 25% sucrose or water for 12 weeks. Briefly, mice were given access to 1 bottle of 25% sucrose and 1 bottle of water available at all times, or 2 bottles of water. They were the control group, available at all times. So they wanted to see, they gave them water and sucrose as options, and then the other one got water and water. So they just wanted to see what would happen. Sucrose and water containing bottles were weighed daily. 2 other groups of mice, also 23 each in those groups, were trained in a restricted access model of sugar consumption, drinking in the dark for 12 weeks. Remember, they're turning on the light and they're turning off the light to see if that has any bearing on this as well. Over a 12-week period, same protocol as the other 2 groups. Briefly, mice were given access to 1 bottle of 25% sucrose for a 2-hour period on Monday to Friday. Drinking sessions started 3 hours into the dark cycle. Sucrose-containing bottles were weighed prior to presentation, as well as after the 2-hour presentation. All right, so here's where it gets good. Behavioral testing. Following 5 weeks of sucrose consumption, one set of animals undertook 5 behavioral tests, and they were conducted over a 6-week period. These behavioral tests were conducted during dark cycle and were withdrawn from sucrose for 24 hours. Elevated plus maze, EPM, a behavioral test used to observe anxiety-related behavior, was performed in an apparatus comprising of 4 arms, 2 open arms, 2 closed arms, elevated 50 centimeters above the floor. The closed arms were fenced with a 40 centimeter high wall. The experiment went for 5 minutes with initial mouse placement in the center, facing the open arm. The number of entries and time spent in each arm was recorded using some tracking software. So this is interesting. They wanted to see, okay, now that they've made their choice, how are they going to behave in reaction? Novelty suppressed feeding tests measures the novelty-induced anxiety impulse control by assessing the latency to approach and eating familiar food in a novel, aversive environment. Animals were food deprived for 16 hours before then being placed in an open area with new bedding, a piece of familiar chow in the middle of the area. Latency to food was measured in seconds before the animal ate the food by 2 experimenters who were blinded to what the diet was. Another test called marble burying is used to test anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder-like behavior. This was performed in individual plastic cages containing 5 centimeters of thick sawdust bedding. 10 glass marbles were evenly spaced in 2 rows of 5 marbles on the bedding. After 20 minutes, the number of unburied marbles was averaged from counting by 2 experimenters. A marble covered at least 2/3 of its size by sawdust will be considered as buried. So again, they're trying to test what impact did this sugar have on these mice and their cognitive abilities. It's a really fascinating test. A couple of more tests they did. Open field test is used to measure exploratory behavior, general locomotor behavior, and anxiety. It was performed in an open area. The floor was divided into 16 equal squares, and a central region was considered as the center. Outside the central region was considered on the periphery. Mice were initially placed in one of the corners and then allowed to explore freely for 10 minutes. The number of entries and the time spent in the center or periphery were recorded. General locomotor activity was assessed using the open field apparatus and recorded using the software. And then the last test they did, the forced swimming test, commonly used to test the efficacy of antidepressants and by extension to assess depressive-like behaviors. They wanted to see, was the sugar impacting depressive-like behaviors. So this test was conducted in a cylindrical glass container measuring 50 centimeters in height and a diameter of 20 centimeters, and the immobility time was recorded using software. Okay, so that's all the behavior testing that they did on these mice. Next up in the study, memory assessment. Using a separate group of animals on the same drinking protocol, 2 recognition spatial memory tests were conducted. After 8 weeks of 25% sucrose consumption, recognition episodic memory was assessed using a novel object recognition test. It ran for over 4 days, was performed in an open field apparatus. On the first day, mice were habituated to the open field apparatus for 10 minutes. The second and third day, they were presented 2 identical objects for 10 minutes. No animals were excluded from the analysis based on their object exploration times. On the last day, under 24 hours of withdrawal from the 25% sucrose solution, one of the 2 familiar objects was replaced with a brand new novel object. And then the interactions with the objects, including metrics such as object exploration time and latency to reach the novel and familiar objects, were recorded in a software. So again, they're trying to see, did the sugar and then the withdrawal from said sugar have a cognitive impact on their memory? The same animals continued to drink the 25% sucrose for 2 more weeks before the spatial recognition was measured using this thing called the Morris water maze. This test evaluates the animal's ability to escape a stressful situation while in a large pool of water. The heated pool was divided into 4 quadrants with a designated visual cue in each of the quadrants. They used a 4-day protocol with this, starting with a pre-training habituation day, where the location of the escape platform was introduced with the platform being visible 1 centimeter above the water. Each animal was placed on the platform for 10 seconds before being released into the water facing the platform less than 10 centimeters away. Once the platform was reached, place mouse onto the platform for 10 seconds and then release again at a greater distance away. This was repeated a 3rd time, again for 30 centimeters away. So if the platform was not reached, the experimenter gently guided the mouse to the platform, and then the animal was released in the water again until the mouse swam to the platform unaided. So on day 2, they called that training day, the platform was partially covered by water and odorless, non-toxic paint was added so the platform could not be seen. Each animal had 8 trials of 60 seconds each to try to swim to the platform, being released from each quadrant while facing the wall twice in random order. Between trials, the mouse had a 45-second break before the next one commenced in a warmed holding cage. On day 3, which was the actual day of the test, performed under 24-hour withdrawal from 25% sucrose solution, each of the animals was released from the furthest quadrant to reach the platform and then removed from the pool if they didn't get there within 60 seconds. This time spent to reach the platform was then recorded manually, having up to 1 minute to reach the platform. Testing videos were all recorded with the software. Day 4 involved probing the animal's memory, with the platform being removed and the amount of time spent in the quadrant or in the platform area, again tracking their every move. Heating pads and lamps were used and readily available all across the 4 days. So as you can see, they put these mice through some extensive tests just to see what is the impact of having the sugar and then taking them away from the sugar for a period of time on various memory and cognitive effects. How about neurogenesis? Following 12 weeks of sucrose drinking, a total of 3 intraperitoneal injections of the cell proliferation marker, and this is a big fancy word, guys, so stick with me, 5-ethinyl-2-deoxyuridine were administered over two weeks. They did it on day 0, 7, and 15, as previously described. This dose has been reported to label all actively dividing precursors in the mouse subgranular zone. 1 week after the last injection, animals were deeply put under anesthesia with sodium pentobarbital and then transcardially perfused with 4% paraformaldehyde. Brains were then harvested and post-fixed in the same fixative overnight. 30 micron thick coronal vibratome sections were collected and kept. They're basically trying to pull what happened in their brain. We want to see that. So I'll skip some of that gobbledygook because you're more interested in what happened, Jimmy, and we're getting to that. They did the imaging and analysis looking at the various parts of the brain. They did all the typical statistical analysis. All right, let's get to the results because this is what's really fascinating. And again, I'm going to remind you, this is just a mouse study. And because I'm not Mighty Mouse, here I come to save the day, it doesn't really have application directly to humans, but it's interesting enough as a hypothesis based on some other research that has been out there that we really need to use the data from this study of what they found and apply it to humans. Let's see what happens. So let's look at what they did see in their results. Long-term sucrose intake increased weight gain. We assessed the effects of long-term unrestricted access to sucrose on body weight over a 12-week period, 60 total days. After 12 weeks of access to 25% sucrose, mice exhibited stable levels of sucrose intake, somewhere around 80 to 90 grams per kilogram per day. A significant increase in the overall weight was observed, starting around week 4, increasing through week 12, until reaching 10.6% overweight compared to the water controls. In other words, they gained almost 11% of their weight compared to the control group. You guys tried the Paleo Valley beef sticks? These beef sticks are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished, and many of the grass-fed beef sticks on the market today are actually finished with grains. They use beef sourced from small domestic farms in the United States. They only use real organic spices to flavor the beef sticks versus all the conventional spices sprayed with pesticides and other natural flavors from GMO. They also ferment the sticks, which creates naturally occurring probiotics, all great for your gut health, and best of all, they taste amazing. Again, they're Paleo Valley, my favorite beef stick on the market today. Go check them out, you guys. PaleoValley.com. Use the coupon code Jimmy at checkout for 15% off your first order. Paleo Valley beef sticks. And it's interesting, it didn't kick in until 4 weeks into this protocol, which is why, like, sometimes people don't even notice the weight gain from the sugar because it kind of, and we know why. We know that insulin kind of has to do its thing and start being ramped up, and then you start to get insulin resistant, and that's when the weight gain starts to happen. Long-term sucrose intake does not produce anxiety and depressive-like behavior. Sugar-withdrawn rats consistently exhibited both anxious and depressive-like symptoms. One study of the mice consuming high levels of 10% sucrose for 4 weeks found increased anxiety and depressive-like behavior after 1 week of withdrawal. To evaluate the effect of higher level of sugar intake, somewhere around 85 grams per kilogram within 24 hours, after 6 weeks of exposure on emotional behavior, we assessed withdrawal-induced anxious and depressive-like behaviors in all those tests that I mentioned earlier. The number of open arm entries within 5 minutes was similar between the sucrose and water control animals, suggesting there was no change in the anxiety-related behavior. That was an interesting one because I think they were expecting that there would be a change. Another test also yielded a similar result with water and sugar exposed animals bearing a similar amount of marbles. Another test showed no difference in the number of entries into the center between sucrose and water exposed animals, hence confirming that there was an absence of any kind of anxiety-like behavior following long-term unrestricted access to sucrose. No change in immobility time in yet another test was evident in sucrose-consuming animals, suggesting that there was no depressive-like symptoms. So that's interesting that the mice didn't perform any differently who were in the sugar group as compared to the water control. Next part of the results, long-term sucrose intake produces hyperactivity and hyperlocomotion. There is growing evidence showing that addiction and substance dependence strongly rely on an increased arousal, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and compulsion following cessation. So when you stop sugar, all of those things commence. To understand how sucrose overconsumption affects hyperactivity and compulsion, we assess general locomotor activity using, again, one of those tests we mentioned earlier. To evaluate the impulse control, we used another test, conflict-based anxiety test, that has been previously been shown to reflect impulsivity-like behavior. And sucrose-consuming mice displayed a higher general locomotor activity. In other words, they got hyperactive, as observed by an increase in total distance travel. In other words, they were literally bouncing off the walls within the mouse cage. This hyperlocomotion was accompanied by hyperactivity, as evidenced by increased average speed in the center of the open field apparatus. The total average speed and the reduced latency to feed in the various tests that they use compared to the water controls. Combined with hyperactivity, this lack of novelty-induced feeding inhibition could be interpreted as a reduction of impulse control to anxiogenic environment, and it further suggests that chronic sucrose consumption produces both hyperactivity and impulsivity. Maybe you're one of those adults that you've always just been one of those people that's just kind of wired, and you're always one of those people that jumps at things. So you jump into relationships, you jump into buying something at the store, you jump into a new job, you jump, and you never understood why. This study might be giving you a bit of a clue that if you ate sugar as a kid, it rewired parts of your brain to make you that way. Isn't this fascinating? Next part of the results, long-term sucrose intake alters both episodic and spatial memory. Since hyperactivity correlates with memory impairments, we assess the consequences of chronic sucrose consumption and subsequent hyperactivity on learning and two types of memory, what's called episodic and spatial, using various tests to test for this. And although sucrose-consuming mice learned to discriminate between old and new objects, the proportion of interaction time with the novel object compared to old object was significantly lower than the water control at 5 minutes and 10 minutes following the presentation of the objects. In one of the tests that they did, sucrose and water drinking mice showed similar latency to reach a visible platform, confirming that although sucrose mice being slightly overweight compared to control groups, there was no alteration in how they learned or their swimming behavior. Newsflash, overweight people are not stupid. However, when the platform was hidden, remember the one that they put underwater and then they painted the platform so you couldn't see it. Watch this. When the platform was hidden, sucrose-consuming mice took longer than water-consuming mice to reach the platform. These results suggest that chronic overconsumption of sucrose will alter the episodic and spatial memory without affecting the learning process. In other words, the ones that didn't have the sugar-induced stupor remembered, oh yeah, there was a platform there. I can't see it, but I'm going to go where that platform was, because they had a memory that that's where they went the previous test. So then when they painted it and it was gone, they couldn't see it. The water ones went, oh yeah, it was there. I can't see it, but it's there. So they went there. Whereas the sugar-induced stupor ones kind of went, which way do we go, George? Which way do we go? And they had trouble. The next part of the results, long-term sucrose intake decreases hippocampal cell proliferation and neurogenesis. Anxiety, depression, and cognitive deficits are strongly associated with an alteration in hippocampal neurogenesis. Although sucrose did not elicit anxiety or depression-like behavior, we assessed whether sucrose-induced deficits in memorization was associated with changes in the hippocampal neurogenesis. Mice chronically consuming a high sucrose diet showed a reduction in the overall density of those cells compared to the water controls. Interesting. Restricting the availability of sucrose dampens the neurocognitive deficits, another part of the results here. The World Health Organization's guidelines recommend restricting the availability of sugar in the current diet and advocate a 4-time reduction of the daily intake of sugar. Therefore, we investigated the consequences of restricting access to sucrose solution to only 2 hours a day. So remember, 22 hours a day, all they had was water and chow. 2 hours a day, they would put this sucrose solution out just to see what would happen. Mice showed a daily intake of sucrose of 21 grams per kilogram, about 4 times less than when they had unrestricted. So accessibility to the sugar in a very restricted time period had them consume 4 times less than when they had availability to it always. Parents, I hope you're listening to that if you have unrestricted access to sugar for your kids, they'll eat a bunch of it. But if you only give them, okay, within this window, you can have as much as you want, they'll actually spontaneously have less because they can only handle just so much at one time. This lower daily intake was associated with no change in the weight gain over 12 weeks compared to water controls. Now that's interesting. They still gained just as much weight. Which my theory on that would be, okay, they induced an insulin response, and the insulin response led to the weight gain independent of the dosage of the sugar. Now, what I think might happen if they did continue on and look at that further, that the longer, the higher dosage of sugar, I think it would speed up the weight gain eventually, and or speed up the disease progression, chronic disease progression from the insulin resistance. We then evaluated if restricting access to sucrose alters anxiety and depression-related behavior. In the same behavioral test, restricting access to sucrose to 2 hours per day did not elicit any change in the anxiety, as evidenced by no difference in one of the tests they ran, no difference in the number of marbles buried, no difference in the number of entries in the center of that other test, no difference observed in the immobility, blah, 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 blah. Interestingly, restricting access to sucrose still elicited hyperactivity. So while it didn't increase anxiety, that bouncing off the wall syndrome remained. Interesting. It also, because the hyperactivity, they said because they saw a significant increase in the total distance traveled, the speed in the center, and the total speed in that test compared to the water. However, there was no change in the latency to feed compared to water controls. These results suggest that restricting sucrose availability and reducing overall daily intake does not affect the inhibitory control to resist food despite promoting hyperactivity. This increased hyperactivity with no deficits in control to resist food was not accompanied by any alteration in memory, as evidenced by no change in some of those other tests. All right, discussion. We're almost at the end of the study, guys. Sugar became embedded in the food and beverage chains, leading to overconsumption in children and adolescents. It is therefore important to investigate how long-term intake of sugar, starting at adolescence, leads to a long-term effect into adulthood. I mean, why would anybody think that how you ate as a kid would not impact how you ate and how you felt and have an impact physiologically, emotionally, memory, all the brain stuff as an adult? Maybe I'm too close to it because I've been at this for a very long time, and I've kind of investigated every which way but loose the impact that food has on the body. But I'm just amazed when people find out, oh wow, all those Oreo cookies I ate as a kid are impacting me now. And I keep thinking myself, I just go, how could they not, dude? Like literally, how could they not? Now the good news is, you don't have to stay there. I think changing to a ketogenic, real food, carnivore, paleo, one of these healthy diets is going to put you in a lot better place, mentally speaking, cognitively speaking, mood speaking. All those things are going to get better. but you started off your childhood having all those things, and now you're at this point where you've got inexplicable brain health issues, and you just kind of go, what in the hell? It's the sugar stupid, to paraphrase a common phrase. So this present study shows there are deleterious effects of long-term sugar intake on weight gain, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and deficits in memory and hippocampal neurogenesis. So while the World Health Organization recommends that the amount of sugar and sugar sweetened be reduced by 4-fold to decrease the risk of childhood obesity and overweight, the impact of sugar on the rising obesity rates is still being debated. I don't think it should be debated. I think it makes total sense if you think about the insulin hypothesis of obesity. Gary Taubes has been talking about this forever, that as we increased refined carbohydrate consumption, especially from sugar, but we'll throw grains and starches in there as well, refined, all of these things, then that's when we saw the massive increase in obesity, the massive increase in heart disease and diabetes and cancers and Alzheimer's and all the things, all related to insulin resistance and all related to every aspect of your health. We think our brain health is separate from our heart health, is separate from every other part of our health in our body, and they're all interrelated. Overall sugar consumption has dropped since the mid-90s, whereas the obesity rate has continuously increased. It's been proposed that this rise in obesity could result from a delayed effect of excess sugar. Exactly, just like they saw. It took 4 weeks for those mice before they started seeing weight gain. Remember, mice kind of show an accelerated version of what would happen in a human. And so 4 weeks could be the equivalent of a couple of years in an adult. And so they're just now catching up to all that excessive sugar consumption now manifesting as obesity. So will we see, with that decrease in the 90s and beyond of sugar, will we see correlative data and reductions in obesity as we get into 2025, 2030? Maybe. But there's more things than just sugar that impact your weight. Stress being a big one, but that's another topic for another day. It's been proposed this rise could result from a delayed effect of sugar, suggesting that adult obesity could be driven by high sugar intake over a lifespan. There are many ways that a decrease in overall sugar consumption and an increase in obesity can be viewed. Sugar has hidden properties, things that activate the hypothalamus. It inhibits ghrelin and leptin, leading to overeating of other types of foods. So they're also kind of putting out the proposal that in addition to some of these hormonal effects, that the overconsumption of all foods will lead to weight gain, which is true. If you overconsume anything, you can actually lead to weight gain, but I don't think it's the calories. I remember interviewing Dr. Richard Bernstein. He's a very famous diabetes expert. And he told me, he said, Jimmy, you could eat pebbles and induce an insulin response. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, anything that distends the gut. In other words, if you eat beyond satiety and you have this distension of the gut because you ate so much, you overconsumed food, that it's the overconsumption of the food that distends the gut that releases insulin, not the excess calories. So those that consume a whole lot of food well beyond satiety, no matter what the food is, even if it's the best keto foods, you could have the big steaks and just load yourself up on them. If you overdo it and you distend the gut because you overconsumed, you're actually releasing insulin doing that. Has nothing to do with the calories, has everything to do with the insulin response. Fascinating, huh? It has been shown that both obesity and the taste of sweet can be passed on through the epigenetic modification. Taste of sweet, guys. Those of you that are addicted to your keto sweets, just keep that in mind. You're kind of telling your brain, okay, we need more of that hit because we need a dopamine response from that sweet. I did an experiment one time in the late 2000s, sweet-free for 30 days. So no sugar, obviously, but nothing sweet on the tongue. So no sweet treats, no fruit like berries, nothing. And in fact, it got to the point where I actually had to cut out almonds because they were too sweet. Anything that tasted sweet, I wanted just savory for 30 days to see what would happen. It was a really fascinating kind of experiment, and I encourage you, try that sometime. Maybe not 30 days, maybe try it a week or two and see how you do. Go sweet free and watch what happens to various parts of your health and how you feel and just subjective things. It's pretty fascinating. So, in line with this, we observed that unrestricted access to sugar beginning at adolescence only starts to affect weight gain into adulthood after about 4 to 5 weeks of sucrose consumption. Although rodent models of diet-induced obesity use body weight as a measure of obesity, the effects of high sugar diets on body weight are inconsistent. While we observed a significant increase in weight gain in sucrose-consuming animals, we cannot comment on the potential link between obesity and long-term unrestricted access to sugar. Further investigation is needed, such as adiposity, insulin resistance, leptin, adiponectin. All of these will be needed to elucidate how long-term sucrose consumption can predispose people to obesity. Interestingly, we found that a 4 times reduction of daily sucrose intake is able to prevent sugar-induced weight gain, which does support the World Health Organization's desire to lower sugar, to lower the rates of obesity. We showed in our study that long-term sucrose consumption did not produce any anxiety or depression-related behavior, although previous studies did show acute and chronic withdrawal from sucrose will make you anxious and depressive. Anxiety and depression-like behaviors are likely present if withdrawal follows extensive periods of sucrose. So the longer you had the sugar, and then you would have the withdrawal symptoms, then it impacts you worse. Short-term exposure to sucrose of less than a month does not lead to these anxiety-like behaviors. So in other words, the addictive property has to kind of set in, and 1 month's not enough. But those of us that were addicted to sugar, keep in mind, Jimmy Moore used to drink 16 cans of Coca-Cola a day, 8 whole boxes of Little Debbie snack cakes a day. I was a sugar for decades, a couple decades, 2-3 decades. And then I went on the Atkins diet and just went, and it was the shock to the system that woke me up of how bad it was. All right, let's skip ahead as well because we're almost here at the end. All right, so they're just recapping all the things that I've already read, so I don't want to belabor the point of what we've already read. Okay. All right, so let's get to the limitation of the study. So this is where they admit okay, things might be a little more complicated than what we've made them out to be. A limitation of this investigation is that the results may not be applicable to female models of sugar overconsumption since they only used male mice in the test. The C57B16 male mice have both increased overall activity and heightened anxiety when compared to female mice. So that's just a general characteristic of these mice, particularly in maternal separation and chronic stress models, meaning the subtle differences in the behavior of male mice are much more easily detected compared to the female mice. So if they'd used female mice, you wouldn't know if it was the thing you were trying to observe or if it was the stress-induced, the chronic stress model, or the maternal separation. You just don't know why they would be acting the way they're acting. So therefore, it would increase the methodological complexity of including female mice in the study, as all data would need to be normalized to this cycle. Females are also widely underrepresented in all the preclinical models of addiction, with a majority of studies in the field conducted only on male mice. This is a major ongoing issue with neuroscience research, and further investigation should explore if similar behavioral consequences of sugar consumption are present in female rodents. I would love to see them do an all-female rodent, exact same protocol that they did with this one, just with the female rodents, and taking into account that they're going to have these other, things that would impact. Because I don't think that does a service to the female population if you do not see what happens in the female mice. However, we do believe the results of this study provide a foundational knowledge that can be extended upon to benefit addiction and obesity generally. Together, our study demonstrates that excessive sugar consumption starting at adolescence elicits profound locomotor and memory deficits in adulthood that may mimic the hyperactivity and cognitive dysfunctions that are then observed in attention deficits like ADHD and hyperactivity-like disorders. More interestingly, our results reveal that restricting sugar consumption intake, as recommended by the World Health Organization, might be effective in limiting these negative consequences of sugar on obesity, locomotor, and cognitive impairment. So guys, that's the study. Really, really fascinating. Again, it was published in the June 2021 issue of the journal Frontiers in Neuroscience. Thank you to the Aussies who did this study. And a really great study. Again, the title, Long-Term Overconsumption of Sugar Starting at Adolescence Produces Persistent Hyperactivity and Neurocognitive Deficits in Adulthood. So thank you guys so much for watching here today. Again, go to Jimmy Makes Science Simple over on Instagram. You can sign up and subscribe to that page. Follow me there. And anytime I do a new study, do a lot of studies outside of what I share here on my podcast, but anytime I do a new study, they do show up there if you want to keep up with this. So thanks so much for watching the Living La Vida Low Carb Show today, and we'll see you again real soon.
Get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com. Woo!
Real Good Foods is one of the fastest growing frozen food companies in the U.S. Everything they make is nutrient dense, high in protein, low in carbs, and made from real food ingredients. Instead of using processed flours, everything they make is 100% grain-free and gluten-free, which is how they keep their carbs so low. They can be found at Costco, Walmart, Target, Kroger, and in almost every grocery store nationwide. Or you can order online. Check us out today at realgoodfoods.com and at Real Good Foods on social media.